The cold was a constant thief. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the warmth from her breath, and the hope from her heart. Alara knelt on the frozen stones of the washhouse floor, her knuckles raw and bleeding as she scrubbed a linen shirt that would never belong to her. The lye soap bit into the cracks in her skin, a familiar, cleansing pain. Pain, at least, was a reminder she was still alive. They called her Omega. It was less a rank and more a curse, a word spat like venom. She was an orphan, a stray taken in by the Blackwood pack out of a pity that had long since curdled into resentment. She was the last to eat, the first to be blamed. She was a shadow that served, a ghost that cleaned, a creature meant to be unseen and unheard. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, heavier than any physical mark. A gust of wind, sharp as a wolf's claw, sliced through the gaps in the washhouse walls. It carried the scent of pine and the coming storm, a heavy, iron-tinged smell that promised a bitter night. Alara shivered, her threadbare tunic offering no defense. She finished the last shirt, her movements stiff and aching, and hauled the heavy wooden bucket of icy water outside to discard it. The world was shades of gray and white, the sky a bruised purple lid pressed down upon the snow-choked forest. Lyra was waiting for her by the kitchens. She stood with her arms crossed, her fine wool cloak a slash of defiant crimson against the muted landscape. Her beauty was as sharp and cold as the winter air, her lips curled in a permanent sneer when she looked at Alara. Lyra was the Pack Alpha's daughter, lauded and adored, and she had made Alara her personal project in cruelty. "Still here, little mouse?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with frost. "I thought the wind might have blown you away by now. You're practically nothing but bone and rags." Alara kept her eyes down, fixed on the scuffed toes of her worn leather boots. Speaking only invited more trouble. Silence was her shield, thin and brittle as it was. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Omega." The command was sharp. Reluctantly, Alara lifted her gaze. Lyra's eyes, the color of chips of ice, raked over her with disdain. "Alpha Kale arrives tonight. The Supreme Alpha, the King." She said the title with a breathless reverence that turned to acid as she looked back at Alara. "All hands are needed to make the pack house presentable. That includes you. Try not to track your filth everywhere." Alara gave a small, jerky nod. The name Kale meant little to her beyond a distant, terrifying legend. A king who was centuries old, a warrior whose power was absolute. He was a figure from stories, not someone who would ever step into her miserable reality. She turned to leave, but Lyra's hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, nails digging into Alara's thin bicep. "And one more thing," Lyra hissed, her face close. Her breath smelled of sweet wine. "Stay out of sight. The king has no desire to see the pack's garbage on display. If I see you anywhere near the main hall, I will personally peel the skin from your back. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Alara whispered. The word was a puff of white in the freezing air. It was barely a sound. Lyra shoved her away. "Good. Now get back to work. The floors won't scrub themselves." Alara stumbled, catching her balance on the icy ground. She didn't look back. She just hurried away, the sting of Lyra's nails a fresh hurt to add to the collection. Inside, a tiny, foolish spark of defiance flickered. She gritted her teeth, the ache in her jaw a counterpoint to the ache in her arm. She would survive this day. She would survive this winter. She always did. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The storm hit with the fury of a betrayed god. One moment, the sky was a darkening sheet of gray. The next, The world dissolved into a blinding chaos of wind and snow. Alara was on her way back from the woods, her arms laden with a bundle of firewood she had been ordered to fetch, when the blizzard descended. The path vanished. The trees became monstrous, clawing shapes in the white maelstrom. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness in her limbs. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The wind howled, a living thing that tore at her clothes and screamed in her ears. Every direction looked the same. Every breath was a gasp of ice that burned her lungs. She was lost. She pushed forward, driven by a primal need to find shelter. But the snow was deep, a hungry entity that dragged at her legs, pulling her down. Her strength was failing. The firewood, once a vital task, was now an impossible burden. With a sob of frustration, she let the logs fall, scattering into the rapidly accumulating drifts. She had to keep moving. Her foot caught on a hidden root. She pitched forward, crying out as her head struck something hard. Dazed, she lay in the snow, the world tilting crazily. The cold was no longer just a thief. It was a predator, sinking its teeth deep into her bones. A strange warmth began to spread through her, a dangerous lethargy. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, so easy to sleep. No. That stubborn spark inside her flared again. She would not die here, not like this. Not for a bundle of wood and the spite of an alpha's daughter. She pushed herself up, her limbs heavy as stone. She took one step, then another. She was walking on instinct alone, a desperate prayer her only guide. The ground beneath her suddenly gave way. There was a sickening crack, and then nothing but an explosion of unbelievable cold. Icy water closed over her head, stealing her breath, her sight, her thoughts. It was a crushing, absolute shock. She had stumbled onto a frozen stream, its surface hidden by the fresh snow. Her waterlogged tunic dragged her down, a leaden shroud. Her lungs screamed for air. Thrashing weakly, her hands met only the smooth, unyielding underside of the ice. She was trapped. Darkness bloomed at the edges of her vision. The fight began to leave her, replaced by a profound, sorrowful acceptance. This was it. This was the end of her small, worthless life. Her last thought was not of anger or fear, but of a quiet, lonely regret. A shadow moved above the ice, a dark shape against the swirling white. Then, a sound like thunder shattered the world. The ice above her exploded inward. A hand, large and impossibly strong, closed around the front of her tunic. She was hauled from the water with a force that seemed to defy nature itself. She landed on the snowy bank, coughing and sputtering, her body convulsing with violent shivers. She was alive. She couldn't believe it. She looked up at her savior, her vision blurred with water and encroaching unconsciousness. He was a giant, a mountain of a man cloaked in dark furs. Snow clung to his broad shoulders and his long black hair, but it was his eyes that held her. They were not a normal color. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to generate its own heat. They were the eyes of a predator, the eyes of a king. He knelt beside her, his expression harsh and unreadable. He was assessing her, his gaze sweeping over her shivering form. Without a word, he reached out, his bare hand moving toward her face, perhaps to brush the wet hair from her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, the world ignited. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a fire, a searing, white-hot blaze that erupted from the point of contact. It screamed through her veins, a torrent of power and sensation that obliterated the cold, the pain, the fear. A light, brilliant and pure, flashed behind her eyes. She felt more than saw a symbol being etched into her skin, a burning brand just below her collarbone. It was a swirling, intricate knot of lines that felt both alien and intimately familiar. She cried out, a sound that was half pain and half awe. What was happening to me? The question was a frantic whisper in her mind. The man recoiled as if struck, his hand pulling back. He stared at her, his golden eyes widening. The predatory harshness in his face was gone, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute disbelief. The air around them crackled with an unseen energy. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. He stared at the spot on her collarbone, now hidden again by the wet fabric of her tunic. He knew what had happened. She could see the knowledge dawning in his face, a revelation that shook him to his core. His deep voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep within the earth. It was a sound of utter certainty, of a truth finally found after a lifetime of searching. You're her. The words made no sense. Her mind, reeling from the cold and the impossible heat, couldn't process them. She could only stare at him, this terrifying, beautiful man with eyes of fire. Her body, however, understood on a level her consciousness could not. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a deep, thrumming hum that seemed to resonate with the very air he breathed. An instinct she never knew she possessed screamed a single, possessive word in the depths of her soul. Mate. He moved again, this time with a deliberate, reverent slowness. He shrugged off his own heavy fur cloak and wrapped it around her. The scent of him enveloped her, pine and winter storms and something ancient, something wild. It was the most comforting thing she had ever known. It felt like home. Mine, he growled, the word a possessive claim that vibrated through her entire being. He scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The strength in his embrace was absolute, a cage of warmth and safety she had never imagined possible. Alara's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This was Alpha Kale, the supreme Alpha, the king, a legend. And he was holding her, calling her his. It was impossible. A mistake. She was nothing, a worthless Omega. He would realize his error soon enough, and then his anger would surely be terrible. But as she lay against his solid chest, the steady beat of his heart a powerful drum against her ear, another feeling pushed through the fear. It was a fragile, tentative shoot of hope. For the first time in her life, she was not cold. For the first time, she felt seen. Kale carried her back to the Blackwood pack house as if the raging blizzard were nothing more than a mild breeze. The wind and snow seemed to part for him, his every step sure and powerful. He didn't speak again, his jaw set in a grim line, his golden eyes fixed on the path ahead. But the arm that held her was an unbreakable band of steel, a silent promise of protection. When he strode through the main gates, the pack warriors on duty froze, their eyes widening first at the sight of their king, and then at the bundled, dripping figure in his arms. Whispers erupted behind them as he passed, a wave of shock and speculation. Alara buried her face deeper into the fur of his cloak, wishing she could disappear entirely. Everyone was staring. They were all seeing the Omega, the pack's refuse, in the arms of the Supreme Alpha. He bypassed the Great Hall, ignoring the local Alpha who rushed forward with a panicked expression. Kale's voice cut through the growing murmur. "Prepare your finest guest suite. Now." It was not a request. It was an order that sent the pack scrambling. He took her to a chamber larger than any she had ever been in, with a roaring hearth and thick furs piled on a massive bed. He set her down gently on a plush chair before the fire, his movements surprisingly tender for a man of his immense size and power. "Sit down," he commanded softly, though she was already seated. He turned and left the room, his parting glance a complex mixture of possession, wonder, and a deep, simmering anger that she prayed was not directed at her. Female servants scurried in, their faces a mixture of fear and avid curiosity. They brought warm water, soft towels, and a nightgown of fine, clean wool. They worked in silence, avoiding her eyes, but she could feel their stares on her skin. She saw them glance at the angry red mark that now adorned her collarbone. It had stopped burning, but it tingled with a life of its own, a swirling symbol that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Once she was washed and dressed, huddled in the warm nightgown before the fire, Cale returned. He dismissed the servants with a flick of his hand. He carried a tray with a steaming bowl of stew and a hunk of fresh bread, food she could only ever dream of. He placed it on a small table in front of her. "Eat," he said. Her hands trembled as she picked up the spoon. She was starving, but her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. She took a tentative bite. The rich, savory flavor was an explosion on her tongue. She ate quickly, guiltily, unable to stop herself. He watched her, his golden eyes never leaving her face. He stood by the mantel, a silent, brooding statue of power. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. What happened?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "The bond," he answered, his voice deep and resonant. "The fates have chosen. You are my mate." Alara's spoon clattered into the empty bowl. "No," she breathed. "That's not possible. I am an Omega. I'm no one." The word worthless hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafeningly loud. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, crouching in front of her chair. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He gently tilted her chin up with his fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are not no one," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. "You are the other half of my soul. I have walked this earth for 500 years, alone, waiting for you. Do you think I do not know my own mate when I touch her?" Tears welled in her eyes. It was too much, too fast. A life of cold and misery had not prepared her for this blazing intensity. "But why me?" "I do not know," he admitted, his thumb stroking her jaw. "But it does not matter. You are mine, and I will burn this world to ash before I let anyone harm you." The conviction in his voice was terrifying and, to a part of her she didn't know existed, incredibly thrilling. A commotion outside the door broke the spell. A frantic voice called his name. "Alpha Cale! An urgent message from the southern border! A rogue pack is attacking the outpost!" Cale's expression hardened. He rose to his full height, his tenderness replaced by the cold mask of the king. He looked from the door back to her, his jaw tight with frustration. "I must go," he said, his voice laced with regret. "It will not take long. Stay here. Do not leave this room." He looked at her, a silent command in his eyes. "You will be safe here." He turned and was gone, his presence lingering in the room like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. Alara sat frozen, the warmth of the fire doing little to quell the new chill of fear that crept over her. He was gone. And she was alone again, in a fine room with a full belly but more vulnerable than she had ever been in her life. The hours passed in a haze of disbelief. Alara paced the room, the soft wool of the nightgown a foreign sensation against her skin. She touched the mark on her collarbone. It was smooth now, a permanent part of her, like a dark, intricate tattoo. The bond. His mate. The words echoed in her head, refusing to take root. How could a king be mated to a creature like her? Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She crawled into the massive bed, the furs so soft and deep she felt as if she were sinking into a cloud. For the first time she could remember, she slept without shivering, wrapped in a lingering scent of pine and winter storms. She was woken by the door creaking open. She sat up, her heart pounding, expecting to see Kyle. But it was not the king who stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Lyra. Lyra stepped into the room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Her gaze swept over the luxurious chamber, the remnants of Alara's meal, the fine nightgown she wore. It was a violation, an offense to the natural order of her world. Her eyes finally landed on Alara, huddled in the center of the bed. "So, it's true," Lyra breathed, her voice dripping with venom. "The little mouse has found herself a lion's den." Alara pulled the furs tighter around herself. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" Lyra laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "I want to know how you did it. What pathetic magic did you use to bewitch him? Did you offer him your filthy body in the snow?" The cruel word struck Alara like a physical blow. "I did nothing," she whispered. "He found me. I was drowning." Lyra stalked closer to the bed, her eyes narrowing. "He carried you in here himself, in his arms. He put you in this room. He fed you." Each statement was an accusation. Her gaze fell to Alara's throat, where the top of the swirling mark was just visible above the neckline of her gown. Lyra's eyes widened in recognition. She had seen such marks in old texts, claiming marks, soul bonds. A terrible understanding dawned on Lyra's face, quickly followed by a twisted, malicious cunning. She saw it all now. The Omega wasn't just a temporary distraction for the king. This was something far more permanent, something that could be used. "So that's it," Lyra said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across her face. "The fates have a sick sense of humor." She looked at Alara not with simple hatred anymore, but with a chilling, calculating expression. Alara was no longer just garbage to be tormented. She was a key, a pawn in a much larger game. "He will be angry when he returns and finds you here," Alara said, trying to sound brave, trying to channel a fraction of the power Kale's presence had given her. Lyra's smile widened. "Oh, I won't be here when he returns," she said softly. "And neither will you." Before Alara could react, the door swung open again. Two large men, their faces hard and their clothes dark and unmarked, filled the doorway. They were not from the Blackwood Pack. They moved with a silent, predatory grace that spoke of dark business. Fear, raw and absolute, seized Alara. She scrambled back on the bed, her eyes darting toward the window, the hearth, anywhere that might offer an escape. There was none. "Take her," Lyra commanded, her voice cold and final. "Be quick about it, and use the silver. Our master wants her compliant." One of the men stepped forward, a set of heavy iron chains in his hands. Woven through the links was a metal that gleamed with a sickly pale light. Silver. The bane of their kind, a magic-dampening poison. As the first chain touched her skin, a pain unlike anything she had ever known ripped through her. It was not just a physical burning, it was a tearing deep in her soul, a violent severing. The bond, that new, vibrant connection to Cale, shrieked in agony. It felt like a part of her was being ripped away. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was cut short as a rough hand clamped over her mouth. They dragged her from the bed, from the warmth and the brief, impossible dream of safety. Lyra watched, her expression triumphant. As they hauled Alara past her, she leaned in close, her whisper a final, venomous promise. "He will never find you," she hissed. "And by the time the Shadow King is done with you, you'll be begging for a death I should have given you years ago." Then they were out of the room, dragging her down a servant's corridor and out into the biting cold of the night. The bond throbbed with a sickening, distant ache. The world was once again a place of pain and fear, colder and darker than ever before. Hope had been a cruel illusion. She was falling, and this time, there was no one to catch her. The journey was a blur of pain and misery. They traveled on horseback, Alara slung over a saddle like a sack of grain, the silver chains burning her wrists and ankles. The cold was a distant misery compared to the agony ripping through her soul. The bond with Cale was a raw, open wound. It felt as if a vital organ had been torn from her body, leaving a gaping void that pulsed with a constant, nauseating ache. Through the pain, she could feel a distant echo of his own frantic, roaring fury. He knew. He knew she was gone. They rode for what felt like days, stopping only to water the horses. They didn't offer her food or drink. They didn't speak to her. She was cargo, a thing to be delivered. They traveled into the heart of a blighted, twisted forest, where the snow was stained gray and the trees grew in skeletal, grasping shapes. A profound wrongness hung in the air, a scent of decay and dark magic. Their destination was a fortress of black, volcanic rock that clawed at the sky like a skeletal hand. It seemed to absorb the light, radiating a palpable chill. This was a place of shadows and despair. They dragged her inside through cold, echoing halls and down into the depths of the earth. The dungeon was carved from the living rock, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and old suffering. They chained her to the wall, the silver links cold and heavy against her skin. The door boomed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. She hung there, her body a symphony of pain. Despair, a thick, suffocating blanket, settled over her. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. "The Shadow King, he will never find you." It was true. How could Cale possibly find her in this forgotten corner of hell? The tiny shoot of hope she had dared to nurture was dead, frozen and shattered. She was worthless, and this was her fate. To die in the dark, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Time ceased to have meaning. It was measured only in the throbbing of the bond, the burning of the silver, the gnawing hunger in her belly. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a refuge of broken dreams. Then, a light. A single torch flared to life at the far end of the cell, held by a figure that emerged from the oppressive darkness. He was tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in robes the color of dried blood. His face was a pale, gaunt mask, dominated by eyes that held no light, only a flat, terrifying emptiness, like chips of obsidian. This was not a wolf. This was something older and far worse. "So," the figure said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "This is the creature who has captured the great king's heart. I must admit, I am disappointed." He glided closer, the torchlight casting long, dancing shadows. He circled her, examining her as one might examine an interesting insect. This was Morgrath, the Shadow King. "You are nothing," he mused, his empty eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Filthy, weak, insignificant. And yet, the bond chose you. A fascinating flaw in the design of the cosmos." Alara pressed herself back against the cold stone, her throat too dry to speak. Fear was a solid thing, a block of ice in her chest. "Do you know what the bond is, little creature?" Morgrath continued, his voice a low, hypnotic drone. "It is a conduit, a gateway to the soul. For centuries, Kale has been untouchable, invincible. His will is iron, his power absolute. But now he has a weakness. Now he has you." He reached out with a long, skeletal finger and traced the glowing mark on her collarbone. His touch was colder than the grave, a violating chill that made her flinch violently. The bond recoiled, shrieking with a fresh wave of pain. "This mark," Morgrath whispered, a sliver of excitement entering his dead voice, "is a doorway. I have a ritual, an old and very powerful one. It will allow me to use this doorway not to enter his heart, but to shatter it. I will pour all my power, all my shadow through you and into him. It will sever the bond, of course. The backlash will kill you instantly. A small price to pay. And it will leave him broken, a hollow shell. His power will be mine for the taking." The casual cruelty of his plan was breathtaking. He would use her to destroy the one person who had ever shown her kindness, the one person who had looked at her and seen something of worth. He would turn their fated connection into a weapon of damnation. Tears streamed down her face, silent tracks of despair. "No," she choked out. Morgrath smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Oh yes, it is already in motion. The Ember Covenant prepares the altar as we speak. You should be honored. Your meaningless life will finally have a purpose. You will be the instrument of a new age, my age." He turned and glided away, leaving her once again in the suffocating darkness. His words had extinguished the last ember of her spirit. She was going to die. And worse, her death would be the doom of the golden-eyed king who had called her mine. She sagged in her chains, a sob tearing from her throat. It was all her fault. If she had just died in the snow, he would still be safe. She was a curse. She had always been a curse. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the abyss. The pain, the fear, the crushing weight of her own worthlessness consumed her. She let go. And in that moment of absolute surrender, in the deepest, blackest pit of her despair, a voice echoed in her mind. It was not a memory. It was real, present, a lifeline thrown into the void. "Alara." It was his voice, Kale, deep and resonant, cutting through the fog of her pain. It was faint, strained by distance and the dampening effect of the silver, but it was there. "Hold on." Her eyes snapped open in the darkness. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She focused on the feeling of him, on the tattered remnants of the bond that still connected them. She poured all her will, all her desperation, into a single, silent scream. "Kale! I feel you!" The voice came back, stronger now. "They cannot hide you from me. I am coming. Fight, Alara. Hold on." The promise was a firebrand in the darkness. He was coming. He hadn't abandoned her. He was fighting for her. A new strength, born of that desperate hope, flowed into her tired limbs. She would not be Morgrath's instrument. She would not be the weapon that destroyed Kale. She would fight. She would hold on. The door to her cell crashed open, not with a whisper of magic, but with the explosive force of a battering ram. Light flooded the dungeon, followed by the roar of a wolf that was less an animal cry and more the sound of a mountain splitting apart. Kale stood there, silhouetted against the chaos of battle. His golden eyes were blazing infernos of rage. He was no longer just a king. He was a primal force of nature, an avatar of vengeance. Behind him, his elite warriors, the Silver Guard, poured into the fortress, their swords and claws reaping a bloody toll on Morgrath's robed acolytes. He saw her, chained to the wall, and the roar died in his throat, replaced by a low, guttural snarl of pure fury. He crossed the cell in an instant, his hands tearing the silver chains from the wall as if they were made of paper. The moment the metal was free of the stone, he snapped the links with his bare hands. The instant the silver was no longer touching her, the bond flared back to life with breathtaking intensity. It was a tidal wave of relief, of rightness, of coming home. It flooded the void inside her, chasing away the pain and despair. She could feel his emotions crashing into her, his rage, his fear for her, and an overwhelming, possessive love that left her breathless. "I have you," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she didn't care. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of him, the scent of safety. But the moment was shattered. Morgrath appeared at the entrance to the dungeon, his face a mask of cold fury. He was flanked by two hulking creatures made of living shadow, their forms shifting and writhing. "You are too late, Wolf King," Morgrath hissed. "The ritual does not need an altar. It only needs her." Kyle pushed Alara gently behind him, shielding her with his body. "You will not touch her," he growled, his body beginning to shift, his form elongating, muscles bunching under his skin. He was preparing to release his wolf. "I don't need to touch her," Morgrath said with a chilling smile. "I only need to kill you in front of her. The trauma of your death will shatter the bond and her mind all at once. A different method, but the same result." The shadow creatures surged forward. Kale met them with a roar, transforming fully into a colossal wolf, larger than any she could have imagined. His fur was the color of a midnight storm, his eyes burning gold. He was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle of righteous fury. He tore into the shadow creatures, his claws and teeth ripping through their insubstantial forms, but they reformed as quickly as he could destroy them. Morgrath himself advanced, a long, thin blade of obsidian appearing in his hand. It pulsed with a dark, sickly energy. He engaged Kale, his movements unnaturally fast. It was a dance of darkness and fury, shadow and light. Kale was stronger, but Morgrath was cunning, his cursed blade seeking any opening. Alara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was helpless, a spectator to a battle for her soul. She saw Morgrath faint, and Kale, distracted by one of the reforming shadow creatures, left an opening. Morgrath's blade darted in, slicing a deep gash across Kale's massive shoulder. Kale roared in pain, a sound that echoed not just in the dungeon, but deep inside Alara's soul. The bond screamed. She felt his agony as if it were her own, a white-hot fire in her own shoulder. He stumbled, his golden eyes flickering. The cursed blade was sapping his strength. Seeing him hurt, seeing him falter, the king who had saved her, the mate who had claimed her, something inside Alara broke. It was not a gentle cracking. It was a cataclysmic shattering of every wall she had ever built around her heart. The years of abuse, the ingrained worthlessness, the fear and the despair, it all burned away in a sudden, volcanic eruption of pure, protective rage. A power she never knew she possessed, a dormant sun that had slept within her for her entire life, awakened. No! The word was not a whisper. It was a shockwave of sound and force that ripped through the dungeon. A blinding, brilliant white light exploded from her body, a nova of pure, untamed energy. The light slammed into the shadow creatures, and they didn't just dissipate. They vaporized, screaming a silent, agonizing shriek as they were erased from existence. The light washed over Kale, and the dark magic of his wound sizzled and vanished, the gash closing before her eyes. The light struck Morgrath, flinging him back against the far wall with enough force to crack the stone. The dungeon was silent, bathed in the soft, residual glow that emanated from Alara. She stood tall, no longer huddled or afraid. Her eyes, once the color of a timid forest floor, were now glowing with an inner luminescence, the color of pure starlight. The air around her hummed with power. She felt it, a vast and limitless ocean of it, now hers to command. Morgrath pushed himself to his feet, his obsidian eyes wide with shock and disbelief. What are you?" he stammered. Alara took a step forward, and then another. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang with the authority of a queen, with the finality of a judge. "I am the one you called worthless," she said, the light around her intensifying. "I am the one you called nothing." She raised a hand, and tendrils of pure light coiled around her fingers like living serpents. "And you will not touch him." She thrust her hand forward. A beam of concentrated light, impossibly bright, shot across the room and struck Morgrath square in the chest. He screamed, a high, thin sound of utter agony as the light consumed him. It was not a fire that burned flesh, but a fire that burned souls, annihilating the shadows he was made of. He dissolved into dust and echoes, his final scream swallowed by the cleansing light. The light faded, leaving behind only the flickering torchlight and the sudden, profound silence. The battle was over. Kale, now back in his human form, stared at her. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a victim to be rescued, but as an equal, a force of nature in her own right. He took a slow step toward her, then another. He stopped just before her, his golden eyes searching her face. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before gently touching her cheek. His touch was warm and real, grounding her in the aftermath of the storm that had raged within her. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with a reverence that made her heart ache. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming release. The power receded, sinking back beneath her skin, leaving her feeling exhausted, but whole. She leaned into his touch, a wave of dizziness washing over her. He caught her as her knees buckled, scooping her into his arms once more. This time, it felt different. It was not the powerful saving the weak. It was one half of a whole finding the other. "I have you," he murmured into her hair, his voice a bedrock of certainty in her chaotic world. "I will always have you." He carried her out of the dungeon, stepping over the bodies of their enemies and into the torchlit halls of the conquered fortress. His warriors, the fearsome Silver Guard, stopped their grim work to stare. They looked at her, held in their king's arms, and they did not see a rescued Omega. They saw the source of the blinding light that had ended the battle. They saw power. They saw their queen. They lowered their heads in a gesture of deep, unforced respect. Kale never stopped. He carried her out of that place of shadows and back into the clean, cold air of the winter night. The blizzard had passed. The sky was a clear, dark velvet cloth strewn with diamonds. The moon was full and bright, bathing the snow-covered world in a soft silver light. He walked to a clearing and finally set her down, though he kept his hands on her arms, as if afraid she might vanish. They stood there for a long moment, simply breathing the same air, their eyes locked. "Your power," he started, his voice still filled with wonder. "It's like the heart of a star." "I didn't know," she whispered, looking down at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I never knew." "He called you worthless," Kale said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "They all did. They were blind." He lifted her chin, his golden eyes burning into hers. "You are the most powerful being I have ever met. You are my queen in truth, not just by bond." He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, soul-shattering reverence. It was a seal, a promise, an acceptance of everything she was and everything she would become. As his lips met hers, the mark on her collarbone blazed with a soft, warm light. She felt a corresponding heat flare over his heart, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that a matching mark was now appearing on his skin. The bond was complete, forged not just by fate, but by choice and by fire. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. "Mine," he murmured again. "Yours," she answered, her voice clear and strong. The word did not feel like a surrender. It felt like a declaration. He took her back to his own kingdom, a vast and beautiful domain of towering, snow-capped mountains and ancient forests that slept under the moon. His home was not a fortress of stone, but a sprawling citadel carved into the heart of a mountain, its halls warmed by geothermal springs and lit by glowing crystals. It was a place of strength and breathtaking beauty. He stood with her on a high balcony overlooking the Central Valley, where his people were gathering. The word had spread. The king had returned, victorious, and he had brought his fated mate. He presented her to them, his arm a possessive, proud band around her waist. His voice boomed across the valley, filled with a love and pride that was unmistakable. "This is Alara, my mate, your queen." A howl went up from 1,000 throats, a joyous, wild sound of acceptance that echoed off the mountains and shook the very stars in the sky. They were cheering for her, for Alara, the Omega, the worthless one. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the kingdom that was now hers, and felt the last vestiges of the cold, frightened girl she had been melt away. Kale's arm tightened around her, his warmth a constant, reassuring presence. She was not a shadow. She was not invisible. She was home. She was loved. She was a queen. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly, incandescently worthy.